Hello everyone, welcome along to another video, and today I was going to discuss some of the things that blind pilots cannot do and if there's anything we can do to mitigate that when we are flying. So one of the things that we cannot do, as we all know, is taxi, and there's nothing we can do to mitigate that at the moment. It's a limitation with the data that is provided to us in the simulator. If it was simple to do, it would have been done already by TFM or some other program. Of course, we hope in the future that with things like sane tensions maybe, and their significantly collected community data on taxiways, that this may be possible, because that data is not necessarily from the sim. It can be hand edited and hand created. So things like that allow us to get a lot more minute data than maybe even the sim provides on the taxiways. But there's not much we can do other than reposition at the moment, and generally this is a decent, if not perfect solution. But that's the obvious one. There's some other things that we cannot do. One of them is non-precision approaches. So you'll find in some areas maybe you have an NDB approach, a VOR approach. These are approaches that are based on very old NavAid equipment, such as VORs or NDBs, normally where you have to fly a certain distance from an NDB or something and then turn back in and land or something like that. Now, the issue with these approaches is the guidance that will be provided within the flight management computer is often very limited. Some of them have more guidance than others, but some of them have predetermined visual segments where you are supposed to be visual with a landmark and you're supposed to take over control. So it's sort of a hybrid approach. Those approaches we cannot do because the visual segment will begin and we will not be able to do it, and the aircraft will then just have to try and fly direct to the runway or something like that, which is probably not what you're meant to do. So there are certain approaches that we just cannot fly. However, this is getting better, I would say, because a lot more precision approaches, so even RNAVs, especially the new RNAV authorization required or RNAV AR approaches into some airports are getting more and more common, and these allow the aircraft, if it is capable, to fly very realistic and accurate GPS based approaches. So especially at these airports where there's like terrain but no ILS, it can fly around the terrain and put you on a pretty decent final to the runway. Now, we all know that RNAVs and blind pilots aren't great because at some point you've got to take out the automatics, whether it's at 100 feet or whatever, and try and perform the landing yourself. And that's difficult when you can't even see the runway, so you're kind of just hoping for the best and hoping you don't get blown too much off the center line, and that you can execute a decent flare and this kind of things. And sometimes it doesn't work out. But if you have a good RNAV approach in the FMC, then normally you can get down. So that's kind of how we mitigate that. Or, if the airport has another runway or some other approach that we can fly, we'll try and do that instead. The other thing that we cannot do is read charts. Now, charts are quite important, and people just think necessarily that the charts sort of just tell you the restrictions on the SID and STAR and approaches. They also have a lot of operational information, though, about the airport. A lot of things that we might not know, and it depends how realistic you want to be. But it's small things, like whether the airport is an automatic handover from tower to departure. So that means the ATC will not tell you need to be handed over. They will just say goodbye to you, and then you will need to switch automatically. Things like noise restrictions. Is it an NADP1? That's a certain type of noise reduction profile for urban areas, and then NADP2 profile for slightly less urbanized areas, and that's to do with the thrust reduction and acceleration altitudes, and they will change depending on the profile. So most airports will publish whether the procedure is an NADP1 or 2. So there's always sort of operational things. Or on arrival, sometimes there's restrictions. They'll say, oh, you can expect this from ATC on the chart, but it won't actually be a firm restriction coded into the FMC. How can we mitigate this? Right, well, one, you can look at your FMC, right? So that will have the hard restrictions in there. You can look at the FMC, you can look at TRAMP if you have that, and read the description, whatever you want to do. Either way, those are the restrictions in the nav data. So you can see there what you're meant to do, what the restrictions are. Now, sometimes, and this especially, I should also add in the US, for example, the top and bottom altitude. What is that? If they tell you in the US, for example, climb via the SID, and they don't give you an altitude, there is no guarantee that the top altitude on the departure will be in the FMC. It usually is in Europe in some cases. Take Heathrow or Gatwick or something. Say Heathrow is always 6,000 feet, and that's always coded into the FMC. So you cannot go above 6,000 FMC unless you hit the altitude intervene button. It won't let you. But in the US, for example, a lot of the times that's not coded in. So how can we mitigate that if we've read through the FMC and maybe we're missing some stuff? Well, one thing you can do is find the charts. Okay, you can find them on AirNav for most US airports, or you can even ask ChatGPT, hey, can you find me the chart for this sit or start? And it will probably find it for you. Europe is a bit more tricky. There's this free service called ChartFox, which tries to find charts for you if you sign in with your VATSIM credentials, or you just a simple Google, right? So if you find the chart, you can then try and read it. Now you have to note that there's going to be visual segments on the chart, and the screen reader will probably jumble things up, but you might be able to glean something from it. Or you could even upload it to ChatGPT and say, hey, can you try and interpret this chart for me? And it does a pretty decent job, okay? You can't be 100% that this is correct, because of course it's liable to be inaccurate sometimes, but it does a pretty good job, right? Much better than we've had before. So that's one thing. But the other thing, and this is often easier for blind pilots, is to look up briefings. A lot of airports will publish briefings, whether this be from VATSIM, from iVow, or from virtual airlines, or from real world sources. So if you just Google, or for example, EDDF, VATSIM briefing. VATSIM Germany is great. They have really comprehensive briefing materials and PDFs which have just text versions of a lot of operational info for you to read. Same with sort of VATSIM Scandinavia, VATSIM UK have some of this. The US is a little bit more sketchy, but it kind of depends. If you find something from iVow or a virtual airline who's maybe put together a briefing for a particular airport, usually, of course, that's good info too, whichever you can find, really. And this, if you read it, will often be key information that you need in a simple text format. They'll split it up into departures, arrivals, whatever, and you can read the info, and it will often tell you things like if it's an automatic handoff or what to expect on arrival, right? So you can see things like, okay, it's going to be call sign only when I call the director. So you know that ahead of time. You can see things that they might say, generally it's 220 knots until so many miles, and then 180 knots until this miles, right? So they'll publish operational information in these briefs that are not necessarily going to be in the FMC, not necessarily even going to be on the chart. Sometimes they are, but you can read the brief, right? So that's useful. And you can use that in combination with the FMC to figure stuff out. It really helps you to get situational awareness then. So you know what to expect on departure and the arrival. You know what to expect on the missed approach if you need to do a missed. That's very important too. People often forget the missed approach and then they panic if they have to do one. It's also useful to look at some other websites for airport operational info. Another thing we cannot do is look at flight radar, right? So when you're on VATSIM and you're departing a certain airport or arriving, it's often difficult to know what runways to use. You can just use what SimBrief gives you, but it doesn't mean that's what's going on in the real world. Now, the US makes this easier because they have published ATISes for most airports. Some other areas, like Canada, for example, has a lot of feeds on liveatc.net, so you can listen to the ATIS. And that's the case for some European airports, not nearly as many, but some. If you can't find that, then you have to do some research, right? And this is another thing in terms of the fact that these briefs that I was talking about that you can often find, they'll often tell you, hey, at this airport, if it's a nighttime arrival, you should use this runway, right? Or this runway configuration is preferred if the tailwind is less than 5 knots or something like that, right? So, for example, I know from reading the Heathrow briefings, right, that the preferred runways generally are 27 left and 27 right. And of course, at 1500 hours, they will switch from one runway to the other. They'll switch departures and arrivals around. If the tailwind component, though, would be more than 5 knots, they use the 09ers. And in that case, it's generally, I believe, 09er left for landings and 09er right for departures. So don't always trust what SimBrief gives you. Read the briefings and try and figure it out for yourself. And also look at the notams. This is also something useful. When you create your flight plan on SimBrief, further down your OFP, it will show you the notams, which is notices to air. It used to be air missions. It's now been changed back to airmen by the Trump administration. But either way, whatever you want to call them, for your departure, your arrival, and your alternate, and also any en route significant meteorological observations, SIGMETs as well. And if you want to see the notams for an airport individually, you can go to weather and notams from the SimBrief dispatch menu, and then you can type in an airport and it will pull up quite usefully the weather, including the transition altitude and the transition level, which you can see, and then also the notams. Now, the notams are usually separated into sections. You'll have sort of general airport notams, then you'll have SID and STAR notams, approach notams, and runway notams. So, for example, you can read the runway notams to figure out, this runway is closed. And this often happens, right? So take the Toronto air accident recently on runway 23. That runway was closed for, I believe, a day or two. And that was in the notams. So when you're, looking at the notams, you can say, okay, runway 23 is closed until this time. And this happens a lot at airports. Or, for example, at Frankfurt, if you read the notams, you will see that there's a notam that is pretty much a daily notam that tells you runway 07 left and 07 right is closed during the night from I think 2300 to 0400 Zulu or something like that. So you have to use 07 center, and I think 18 is closed. So it's pretty much predominantly 07 center that's used during the night. And if you read the notams, you'll know that. Now, there's a lot of junk in the notams, I will give them that, especially for us blind pilots. You'll see a lot of notams about taxiway closures or stand closures or something. It is not particularly relevant, especially for us blind pilots. As I say, we don't really give a shit about it, what taxiways are closed. So you unfortunately have to look through quite a bit of junk. And they're also quite interesting to read, because often they'll use a lot of abbreviations or lingo. You can always paste them into ChatGPT. Again, this is quite useful. If you see some notams about some runway closures or some changes to procedures, often they'll publish slight changes to SID and STAR procedures as well, and you wonder if it's applicable to you, then you can paste them into GPT and say, hey, tell me what this means, what this notam means, and it will tell you. Okay, yeah, it's telling you that between these hours on these days, this runway is going to be closed for maintenance or whatever. So you can look at the notams too, and then you'll have a pretty comprehensive briefing. Now, doing all that on a flight, especially if you just want to relax, I get it, it's tough. And you have to kind of ingrain it into your routine. It's not something you really need. Let's be real. If we're in a simulator flying along, especially just flying offline, not even on VATSIM, does anyone really give a shit if you land on a runway that's closed in real life, or if you are not applying a noise abatement procedure? No, it is what it is. But if you want to try and learn a little bit more, and generally what will happen is you'll get this info a little bit more in your head, where you won't have to keep reading airport briefings for the same airports or whatever. You'll just know these various bullshit things like I was talking about for Heathrow or Frankfurt or whatever, where you fly there quite a bit and you just know that these certain things will probably happen. And this really helps as a blind pilot, because then you don't have to have the screen reader or whatever read all this densely collated information to you. So, you would probably want to read the departure brief and look at the departure notams and figure out shit before departing. And then maybe en route, you can read the arrival notams. And I don't mean read them all. You can just scan them. Okay, that's not relevant, not relevant, not relevant. What's this one? Let's have a look at this, okay? That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And also have a little Google, right? See if you can find any briefings. Does the VATSIM division that I'm flying to have a briefing that can help me replace some of the charts that I'm not really able to access? Can I brief the arrival? You don't necessarily have to do a full real world briefing out loud like maybe a crew would. And okay, now we're going to do this. No, it can be in your head, just so you know, okay, what is the bottom altitude? What are the restrictions I'm going to need to follow? What are the missed approach procedures? And are there any special considerations here that I can find on this briefing document that I need to think about, you know? And again, it's small things, right? So it might be, for example, you read the briefing document and it says, when you go to director, which is another word for approach, often in Europe. So when you go to approach, call sign only, right? And that means when you contact them, you don't need to tell them Vision 2.0 whiskey descending, flight level 80, speed 220 knots. You don't need to tell them that. You just say Vision 2.0 whiskey. So it's small things like that. Is it really going to matter? Not particularly. You know, it's only VATSIM. You say more than you need, whatever. But it just kind of makes you look cool. Maybe I'm just nerdy. Maybe it's just, yeah. But I think if you are able to just gain a little bit more realism sometimes, then it's kind of interesting. You know, you kind of learn as you go, and then that's what it's about. It's not just about take off, throw the airplane on LNAV, VNAV, and step away for 3 hours, and then I'm going to just, you know, let it follow all the plan. And you know, I always say this, and this is why kind of the whole first officer programs my FMC, I just put the SIDS and stars in, all this kind of nonsense. I just think is, well, I don't like it personally. You can call me a stickler, whatever, but I think it's wrong. I think it really means you don't gain knowledge about your aircraft or the airports you're flying to, or how to manipulate the FMC, and then when you actually need to do it in a moment of need, you don't know where anything is. But hey, you know, whatever. So it's not about just setting everything up and just go. It doesn't, you know, if you really want to have a bit more realism, it's got to be about considering operational needs as well. So I hope this was useful, just me rambling about some things that blind pilots can't do, but also some of the things that you can do to kind of guard against making mistakes because of that. If you found this video useful, drop a comment. Maybe I will do another video soon. I'm thinking I'd like to do one on fuel planning. I kind of touched on it, I think, in a previous video about making a more realistic flight plan, but I'd kind of like to do one where I talk about the different kinds of fuel you have: contingency, reserves, final reserves, and kind of when you should divert and when you should not divert, and when you can decide to commit to your destination airport, and what the kind of, to the best of my knowledge, what the rules and regs are, because I would hope I'm somewhat informed, but you know, hey, I'm just a flight simmer, so could definitely be wrong on some of the things that I say too, so take it all with a pinch of salt. But yeah, I will see you in the next video, and yeah, we will we'll see what we can come up with. Hopefully I can do more of these kind of shortish, just talking about sort of operational impacts and how you can get a bit more realism out of the simulator.